Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Made Known. I am your host, Tyler Crawford, and I know that we've been gone for quite a while. We are moving into February 2025. We took a break over the holiday season, and that me and my wife and my child were getting into a new house. So now we're here, and we're ready to jump back into First Corinthians. We're not going to be going very long tonight. We're going for a shorter one since that seems to work on the Facebook algorithm the best. But with me, as always, is Mr. Manny Longfoot.
Hey,
how's it going, Manny?
it's going well. I hope you doing good.
I'm doing good.
I hope so. He done fed me, so I'm doing really good. In his new house, eating his new food, ready to go.
Absolutely.
All
right. Do you want to do the recap?
Yeah, I can.
All right, perfect.
All right. So since it's been a while, in chapter 8, Paul started a subject of idols, but he took it from a different angle in what he's going to do in chapter 10. Paul talked about what is the issue with exercising your rights as a believer, even if it harms your brother in Christ. Then in chapter 9, he used himself as an example of what it means to give up a right. He's an apostle, but he's given up his rights for the Corinthians. Then he ends chapter 9 by talking about how he doesn't want to be disqualified from the race. He wants to live in such a way where he is worthy of the reward he's going to receive, where he's not going to be disqualified from sanctification or rewards from God. And he picks up at that in chapter 10 with a lot of warnings. So he goes back to idolatry, but of course he discusses it from a different angle. And that is the angle of what happens when you mess with God and you decide, I'm going to exercise my rights to the neglect of God, or even go off and worship another God. And Paul has very serious warnings for that. Now, today we're only going to get in the first 5 verses of it. And so we're not going to get quite that far. But with that being said, did I leave anything out?
No, that's basically it. He walks through his ministry that he wants to win souls.
Yep.
Right. It's all about winning souls. And if that means putting yourself back so that another can be built up, that's what we want to do. And his commitment to holiness, when he talks about exercising his body, when he goes through all those different things that the Greeks would know about from the games and all those different things, it's showing yourself to walk in a manner which is acceptable to the call, a commitment to holy living, as to not be caught with your britches down, basically. Right. So
right, you don't want to be in the situation of not being able to press on to maturity. Right. You don't want to be an immature believer. And essentially, Paul is warning the Corinthians that if they keep going down this road and they keep going to temples where there's prostitutes and idols and food sacrifice to idols and rituals to idols, to other gods and demons, they're going to be judged by God because God does not appreciate that and he won't tolerate it. He's not going to tolerate sexual immorality. He's not going to tolerate idolatry. And Paul is telling them, well, we have examples of exactly what God thinks about this from the Old Testament. And so Paul actually uses the Old Testament super extensively.
He does.
To say, well, I ain't just got to tell you from new perspective. I can tell you exactly what happened to the Israelites when they did every one of these things. And fun fact, every single example he gives ends with death.
Yeah.
As the judgment for immaturity. So with that being said, you want to read the first 5 verses?
I will, but I'm also going to jump back into the last chapter, just one verse, because I think it brings all of what we just said to a concise beginning and end. And it says, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Chapter 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, the first thing I want to say is when it's talking about being baptized into the cloud, it is not talking about a storage place for all of your internet data. That's not exactly where Paul is going. He's going into the Old Testament, and he expects us to know.
Well, you just don't put enough stock in Apple. How do you know?
Right. He expects us to know what he's talking about through Exodus. He's expecting his readers to know all of this. And so that just tells me we need to know our Old Testament as well so that we can understand the New Testament and what the authors are trying to get at, where they're pulling from.
Yeah, if you want to think about how well you know your Old Testament as opposed, so we'll just go ahead and jump into verse 1. He says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers. Now, Paul is talking to a mixed audience.
Mhm.
There's a lot of Gentiles. In fact, there's probably more Gentiles than there are Jews. But he still expects them to know the Old Testament, and enough so that he can just reference a spot and then not just know the verse, but the whole story.
Right.
And within about 10 verses, he references quite a few spots and stories that he just assumes they know the whole thing and the whole outcome too. So we'll see if you know your Old Testament as well as even a Gentile did in the first century.
Are you smarter than a
Yeah.
Gentile? In the
So
first
really, this is a good commentary. Chapter 10 is a good commentary in your Old Testament, along with Acts chapter 7. Stephen gives a nice commentary in your Old Testament.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially what Paul is doing here is he's giving the example of the Israelites having all of these benefits, all of these blessings, right? They were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And this cloud refers to God's presence. God tells them in Exodus 13 and Exodus 14 that he's going to go before them in a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire by night, and his presence will be with them. And so they had all these things, and yet, of course, chapter 5 says God was not pleased with them, and their bodies fell in the wilderness. And then Psalm 95 and the writer of Hebrews comments on that. It says it's because of unbelief. So,
Absolutely. I mean, if you go into verse 2, it says they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. The point is they had everything. God had given them everything. He had given them his protection, his presence. He tells them, I'm going to go before you in this cloud and in this fire, and then eventually you're going to make a temple where my spirit's going to be forever, or where my spirit's going to be. Right. So they had all the benefits. They had every opportunity. We see Jesus talking the same way when he was very harsh with the Pharisees, as they were the ones who had all opportunity, supposed to have all the knowledge that would have made them aware of his coming. But that didn't mean that their outcome was the one that we all.
well, let's even just jump forward to verse 12. Paul says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. In other words, you think you're doing good. Look back at the Israelites who had all of these things and they still messed it up.
Mhm.
And of course, Paul is saying, be really careful because you can have all these things. And essentially what he's telling them is Christ is the one who provided all these things. And he's the same one doing it for you. And if you make the same mistakes, you're going to be judged in the same way, which, in quite a few cases may end with a premature death.
Yeah.
And loss of rewards, essentially. So,
Yeah. And we also see that we see Christ in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
A lot of times people don't look for Christ in the Old Testament. You see, a lot of people think about the Old Testament, you have the God of wrath, right? And then you have the New Testament, you have lovey-dovey Jesus that's like just on everybody's side, and by gum, you're a great guy. But that's not the case. Jesus was there from the very beginning. He's in the Godhead of the Trinity and everything else. And this rock that they drank from, of this spiritual drink, I mean, that's Christ. He's all through the pages of the Old Testament. You just have to be willing to look and see when the New Testament references it, and it'll be a whole lot easier to find.
right. So as we mentioned the spiritual food, and of course, John 6 mentions Jesus as the true manna. And then essentially what he's also saying is, right, God provided water from a rock twice, both at Rephidim and at Kadesh. And essentially he's saying Christ provided that. And then he goes on to say in verse 9, he says, let us not tempt, therefore, nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. So yeah, you get into this lovey-dovey Christ issue, and Paul is saying, who's the one that destroyed him? It's Christ.
Yeah.
But this also asks the question, because I've said this a couple times during the series, who does Paul think Christ is? Right? Right? He can't just think he's a prophet. Right. He can't just think he's a good man. I mean, Paul is very clear that when and where Christ was. He can't just simply be an angel, right? He's not the Archangel Michael.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So who does Paul think Christ is? Well, he thinks he's God. And quite clearly, and also the way that Paul sets up this chapter follows the flow of Deuteronomy 32, which chronicles Israel's failings along with Psalm 78. And in that, Yahweh is referred to as the rock 5 times, along with Habakkuk 1:12 as well. But Yahweh is referred to as the rock, and that's probably what Paul is calling back to when he's referring to Christ as the rock.
Yeah. We also see, and this is just what I was thinking, I don't know if Manny agrees with me here, about the covenant, right? These are God's covenant people. He's made a covenant with them. You look in verse 2, it says, all were baptized into Moses. Baptism is a sign of the new covenant. And so when it says they're baptized into Moses, they're baptized into this old covenant through this deliverance, through this protection of God and his presence being all the way around them. But again, that doesn't mean that they're going to get the outcome they want, because they're going to be killed. A lot of them are. We're not jumping past verse 6 very much here tonight, but once we do, you're going to see all the death, all the judgment that is given for wrongdoing. Our God is merciful, but he is also just. And he's patient and he's kind, but he will also bring all things to an account, to a proper end. And so we can't forget that God is justice. And if you don't believe in justice, then just wait till somebody steals your wallet, and then you'll know there's justice.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great analogy. But go for it.
Yeah. He's absolutely right. But with that being said, I mean, this is even back to the subject of Jesus in the Old Testament. Who really led the Israelites out? Which, of course, that could get us into a whole other topic. Like, why does John refer to Jesus as the Word or the angel that God sends before them? But another just interesting thought about it is if you flip over to the book of Jude and you go to verse 5, it says, I want to remind you, though you once knew that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterwards destroyed those who did not believe. Now, those of you with an ESV or a CSB or a LSB or an NLT will actually read, Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, later destroyed those. Those of you who do not have those translations, hopefully you're reading your footnotes, and in which case you will see that our older manuscripts say Jesus saved them out of the land. But the point is that Paul's making is, you're saved by Jesus, but who is it that you need to be worried about offending? It's Jesus, because Jesus is the one who destroyed those he saved because of their unbelief. And so, yeah, you can paint this picture of a lovey-dovey Jesus, and, you know, there's obviously truth in some degree to that. Like, you go to 1 John 4, and Christ loved us in this way that he gave himself up for us. But Christ is also not going to put up with idolatry.
For sure.
Christ is not going to put up with you going off to worship another God or no God at all. He's not going to put up with grumbling and complaining and whining and everything else. He will punish it. And that is essentially Paul's point throughout this chapter is, let's learn from history what God did and what Christ did to the Israelites so that we don't make that same mistake by trying to exercise our Christian rights to go into the temples and eat meat sacrificed to idols and, you know, be around prostitutes and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Everything is permissible for me, right?
Yeah, it's surprising that these Corinthians weren't Americans, you know, really wanting to really push their rights. And I know I've said that in episodes past, but it's still, it always brings it to mind. But it brings me to, our God is a jealous God. And a lot of people think, you know, jealousy is a really bad thing, but not in all ways, right? I'm jealous for my wife because she's my wife. I'm jealous for my daughter because she's my daughter. If somebody tries to take that from me, yeah, there's going to be bad things happen. But there's a difference between jealousy and envy, because I think we use them a lot of synonyms, and they're not. Jealousy is wanting what you have and holding on to it. Envy is either wanting what somebody else has, or if I can't have it, then they can't have it either. And that's a very different thing. We belong to God if we are in Christ. God is jealous for his people in the Old Testament because he brought them out of Egypt. He said, I'm going to take care of you, and you're a people of mine. So act like it. Right. I expect when my daughter gets older, I expect her to act like she belongs to me, you know, and not act a fool.
Well, and in reality, if you think about jealousy as well, there's a level at which if you don't have jealousy, that's a problem. Right? Like, if you weren't to get jealous because your wife ran off to another man, that would be a problem.
Yeah, that would
right?
be a problem.
And in the same way, if God weren't to get jealous because you went off and worshiped another God, would he actually love you?
It's kind of shallow love.
Right? It really is. I mean, I know that we have this concept of, well, if you love me, let me do whatever I want, right?
Yeah.
Love affirms all that I am. Yeah. That's nonsense, right? We don't tell people with anorexia, you're right, you're so fat, let's go get liposuction, right? Because that's not loving. Okay. So in the same way, God, you good?
Good. That's funny.
God should be jealous, and he's not going to put up with idolatry. And that's the danger the Corinthians are in. And they're excusing it as being permissible because they're in Christ. So in other words, they're testing Christ's patience with them, saying because we have freedom in Christ, we can go to the temple and it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And Paul's ultimate concern is an idol may not be anything, but there's something worse behind the idol, and that's a demon. And you may not think you're worshiping an idol, but essentially you are worshiping another god that's a demon. And so, yeah, that's really about all I have on these 5 verses. I know it's short, but it's also our first week back. I want to give you bite-sized chunks, maybe. Some people also said they didn't like the 1.5 hour videos we did.
Yeah, this is really a lot shorter. Did we even read verse 5 again and go over it? But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. It is interesting that most of them, it wasn't just some of them. It was most of them. If you go back and read, I mean, whenever they decided to go, 14. Yeah, but whenever they decided to do that golden calf, God was like, I'm going to kill all of them. I'm just going to keep you, Moses, and I'm going to kill the rest of them. They're all worthless. That
happened twice. It happened after they refused to go in the promised land, too. And they saw the Anakim.
Yeah, it's most of them God was displeased with because they really didn't believe who he was, who he said he was. After everything they'd been through, after everything God had pulled them through, they didn't actually trust him. And so my question for me and for you is look back at all the things that God pulled you from. Look in all the ways that God has protected you. Look in all the ways that God has given you deliverance. And are you acting like you actually care about that? Are you actually acting like God is who he says he is? Like you actually believe he'll do what he says he'll do? Or do we just do whatever crap we want and expect him to just be good with it?
And let's even make that situation worse. God tells Moses, I'm going to war on all the gods of Egypt. Wars on the gods of Egypt, defeats them. All the surrounding nations say we know who Yahweh is because of what he did to the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And what he did to the Egyptian gods, including Moses' stepfather, Jethro. Says, now I know that Yahweh is the God of gods because of what he did to the Egyptians. And then immediately the Israelites turn around and they say, make us a god so we can worship the one who brought us out of Egypt. And Aaron goes, these are your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt.
When do we do the same thing?
I would also, one of the sins that Paul mentions going up ahead, I will get there probably next week, is grumbling, complaining. Ooh.
Yeah.
A lot of us might, throw to the side maybe idolatry. Maybe we're not going into the temple with prostitutes, right? Maybe we're not murderous and slanderous and this and that. What about grumbling? Right? God provides food, and you're upset that it's not the food you wanted. God provides water, and you want it more. You see?
Yeah.
So, just think about some of these sins and how they might affect your life. And then, he says God was not pleased with most of them. How many of them was he pleased with?
Just a few.
Just Joshua and Caleb.
Yeah.
Out of all of them, just Joshua and Caleb. Now, everyone 19, well, really not even everyone 19 and under entered because then they acted goofy later.
Yeah.
But essentially, of the originals, only 2 that were over 20 and over were allowed to enter the promised land.
God is kind. God is just. And are we living like we actually believe he is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do? We'll see you next week. Hope you come along. We're going to try and do them a little more bite-sized chunks. Don't forget to hit that follow button, subscribe, all the different things that you do and people say whenever they're in this little media world. But we thank you and appreciate you. God bless.